The sun beat down on the barren Afghan desert, where every step seemed to whisper the danger that lay ahead. In the midst of it all, she wasn't a soldier, nor an operator. No, she was just an observer, a logistics officer with nothing but a clipboard and a purpose to assess. But when the comms went down, and even the SEALs, the elite warriors known for their unshakable resolve, began lowering their weapons in surrender, she did something nobody expected. Alone, she stepped into the kill zone. It was a place where even the bravest had faltered, a valley known for swallowing whole squads, leaving nothing but traces of their desperate final moments. The SEALs, hardened by years of combat, thought they were out of options. They'd been trapped for too long, facing an unseen enemy who had mastered the terrain. The sky stretched endlessly above them, indifferent to the lives at stake below. Chief Maris, a seasoned veteran of 4 deployments, watched as Lieutenant Commander Ardan Rusk, the observer, moved toward the ridge. Her movements were deliberate, unaffected by the heat or the heavy weight of the mission. She didn't duck, she didn't flinch, and she certainly didn't show the fear that clung to the others. But Rusk knew something they didn't. The moment had come. When all seemed lost, the game was about to change. Her every step carried a quiet certainty, as though she had been waiting for this moment, for this very mission. Before I show you what really happened that day, make sure you're subscribed to Requiem of Fear, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The desert wind at FOB Halverson carried the smell of diesel fuel and resignation, blending into the hot, dry air that enveloped everything. The base, more a collection of patched-up walls than anything resembling permanence, squatted against the Afghan landscape. It seemed like it had long since given up on the illusion of being indestructible. Razor wire, tangled and frayed, crisscrossed the perimeter, each strand a reminder of how many times the base had been tested, and how many times it had survived. The mountains beyond the base rose like broken teeth, jagged and unforgiving. The sky, always a pale shade of yellow, never seemed to change. It was as if the very world had resigned itself to the same oppressive heat and dust. Each gust of wind sent the sand swirling, a reminder of just how brutal this environment was. Lieutenant Commander Ardan Rusk stepped down from the transport helicopter's ramp with the precision that only comes from years of military service. She was in her mid-40s, her brown hair pulled back tight, uniform regulation but worn. The boots she wore had seen countless miles of rough terrain, showing the wear of someone who had long since stopped worrying about the small things like appearances. The clipboard she carried was battered, the edges curled from use, looking like it had been through more deployments than most of the personnel at the base. The rotor wash from the helicopter kicked up clouds of sand, but Rusk didn't flinch. She stood there, perfectly still, her eyes scanning the horizon like a soldier who had learned that discomfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. The rest of the personnel around her scrambled to shield their faces or duck for cover, but Rusk didn't even look bothered. To her, this was just another day in a world that had long stopped offering any comfort. Chief Blake Maris, standing nearby at the fuel depot, noticed her. He had seen soldiers come and go, but there was something about Rusk that caught his attention. She didn't move like the others. There was no hurried, nervous energy, no concern for the heat or the danger that lurked just beyond the wire. She stood as if she was in control of everything. And for a brief moment, Maris wondered if he was wrong about who she really was. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center was thick with tension, as the team gathered around the flickering satellite screens. The mood was somber, almost funeral-like, as if everyone had already accepted the inevitable. Maps covered every available wall, each marked with red X's, the coordinates of locations that had once held soldiers, but now were just another grim reminder of the deadly terrain known as the Scar. The term itself had taken on a life of its own, an almost mythical presence within the squad. Whispered stories of fallen men, of SEAL squads who had been swallowed by the land, never to return. Chief Blake Maris stood at the front, pointing to a specific spot on the map. Grid reference 47 Charlie. Natural depression, about 800 meters across. Steep approaches, no structures, no visible defensive positions. His voice was steady, but there was a certain weight behind it, as though saying those words out loud was admitting a terrifying reality. He paused, his hand hovering over the location where so many had died. 3 teams have gone in over the past 6 months. Bravo Squad lost 4 men and extracted under fire. Delta went in with 8, came out with 3, 2 critical. Echo Squad. Maris trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room already knew what had happened to Echo Squad. They had been marked by GPS coordinates, their last known positions etched into the military system. But their fate was left unspoken, a dark cloud over everyone's head. Rusk sat in the back corner of the room, her clipboard balanced on her knees, taking notes with mechanical precision. She hadn't asked a single question during the briefing, hadn't even flinched when casualty rates were discussed. She was the observer, after all, there to assess, not to intervene. Yet, as she sat there, not even shifting in her chair, her eyes remained fixed on the screen, tracking the contour lines, the elevation changes. It was clear to Maris that she wasn't just taking notes, she was absorbing every detail, like someone who could read the terrain in a way that went beyond military maps. "Any ideas on how to approach this, Chief?" Petty Officer Kumar, the communications specialist, asked, breaking the silence. Maris rubbed the back of his neck, eyes narrowing. "We need to make sure the weather and terrain are in our favor. The SCAR doesn't give you second chances. The enemy's got the high ground, and they know the land better than we do." Rusk, still silent, leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notes. She didn't ask for clarification on the tactical details, but when the wind patterns were mentioned, her pen paused just for a second, her gaze shifting toward the eastern ridge. It was subtle, but Maris noticed it. She wasn't just taking notes, she was thinking. As the briefing came to an end, the weight of the mission settled over everyone in the room. There were no jokes, no small talk, just the sound of chairs scraping against the floor and the rustle of tactical gear being prepared. The SEALs moved with the practiced efficiency of a team that had been through this too many times before. The air was thick with the knowledge that this mission would not go smoothly. It never did in the SCAR. Maris turned to Rusk, who was still seated in the back corner, her eyes scanning the maps with a focus that seemed too intense for an observer. "You'll be staying here, right?" he asked, his voice clipped, a slight edge to it. He was used to working with operators, not observers, especially not ones who seemed so detached. Rusk didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stood up and adjusted the straps on her bag, her movements measured calm. "I'll observe from the optimal vantage point," she said, her voice steady. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet confidence that Maris couldn't quite place. "Optimal for observation isn't optimal for survival," Maris said, his voice dropping slightly as he tried to make her understand. The SCAR had claimed lives before, and he wasn't about to watch another soldier or logistics officer become just another casualty. The ridge they were heading toward was the perfect spot for an ambush. Elevation, natural choke points, the kind of terrain that could make any attempt at survival feel like a gamble. Rusk met his gaze without blinking. "Then I'll try not to get in your way," she replied simply, and that was the end of the conversation. The convoy left just after 0700 hours, 3 vehicles rolling out across the desolate terrain, the harsh Afghan landscape stretching out in all directions. The lead vehicle, a heavily armored MRAP, moved forward with a low hum, its tires kicking up dust as it cut through the dry earth. Behind it, a Humvee carried the bulk of Echo Squad, the men inside checking their weapons for the umpteenth time, making sure every piece of equipment was accounted for. At the rear, two operators on dirt bikes served as scouts, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Rusk sat quietly in the passenger seat of the Humvee, her rucksack at her feet. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the base, her gaze fixed on the horizon. But Maris couldn't help but notice how intently she watched everything. The way her eyes tracked the movement of birds, the shifting shadows, the dust clouds that rose in the distance. It was the kind of attention that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the kind of vigilance that suggested she saw things others didn't. As the convoy neared the scar, the atmosphere grew heavier. Communications over the radio grew sparse. Only the necessary position reports and equipment checks, punctuated by brief moments of silence. There was a gravity to this mission, an understanding that the scar had been a graveyard for many, and this time, it would not be any different unless something changed. When they reached the Overlook Ridge, Maris called a halt. The vehicles formed a defensive perimeter, and Echo Squad dismounted to begin final preparations. But Rusk didn't move to the back of the Humvee or stay near the convoy like everyone else. Instead, she stepped out, scanning the valley below with a pair of binoculars, her stance the same, focused, unshaken, as if she were simply reading the landscape. Maris turned to Santos, who had followed him off the truck. "Is she really planning on staying up here?" Santos muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. The ridge wasn't just an observation point. It was the first line of defense, and it wasn't a safe place for anyone, let alone a logistics officer. Rusk overheard him and simply responded with a quiet, "I'll stay here. You have your mission." The convoy had been in motion for about 30 minutes when the first radio check came through. The crisp, clear voice of Chief Maris crackled over the airwaves, his report calm but precise. "Echo 1 to Overwatch. Status report. Entering target area. No contact. Proceeding to first checkpoint." Rusk, still positioned on the ridge with her binoculars, responded without hesitation. "Overwatch copies. Maintain calm schedule. Continue mission." Her voice was steady, unhurried, as if nothing could faze her. Maris had heard that tone before, calm in the face of chaos. But what he didn't know was that she was already more involved in the mission than he could have imagined. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the heat was unbearable. The sand beneath the SEAL's boots felt like it was on fire, and the air shimmered above the ground, a constant reminder of the harsh conditions. They moved forward, trying to keep their focus sharp despite the oppressive atmosphere. Every step brought them closer to the scar, a place that had been designed to break even the most seasoned soldiers. As the team moved into position, Rusk's mind never stopped working. She scanned the terrain, observing the subtle shifts in the wind, the way the dust moved across the valley floor. She knew that every small detail mattered, that even the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. But she wasn't just observing the environment. She was calculating, assessing, understanding how the landscape could be used to their advantage. It was the kind of analysis that only someone who had spent years in hostile terrain could perform. Back in the valley, Echo Squad was preparing to descend. The SEALs checked their weapons one final time, their movements mechanical but precise. Their minds were focused, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety running through the team. The scar had claimed too many lives already. There was a sense of inevitability about this mission, the kind of quiet acceptance that comes when soldiers know the odds are against them. Maris glanced toward Rusk, who was still on the ridge. He hadn't expected her to be so involved. She had barely spoken during the briefing, didn't seem fazed by the casualties they discussed. She was just there, watching, observing. But now, as he prepared for the next phase of the mission, something about her presence felt like a calculated risk. He didn't like it. At that moment, the radio crackled again. "Echo 1 to Overwatch. Checkpoint 1 secured. No visible threats. Proceeding to Grid 47 Charlie 2. The transmission was clear, but there was a faint distortion in the background. It wasn't much, just a slight interference, but it set Maris on edge. He looked at Santos, his expression hardening. "Keep an eye on them. Something doesn't feel right." But it was too late. Another radio check came through, but this time, it was different. The voice on the other end was broken, fragmented, barely audible through the static. Echo to something, can't identify. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only the soft hiss of empty air. "Shit," Maris muttered under his breath. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He grabbed the radio and switched to the backup frequency. "Echo 1, come in. Do you copy?" Silence. Nothing but the wind and the occasional crackle from the radio. He switched to the emergency channel and tried again, but still no response. Rusk's eyes narrowed as she scanned the valley below. Something was off. She could sense it, feel it in her bones. She didn't need to hear the radio to know that Echo Squad was in trouble. She had been in situations like this before. Isolated, surrounded, with no one to rely on but yourself. The scar was a place that had broken many men, but it wasn't going to break her. Without a word, she began to unbuckle her rucksack and set it aside. Her movements were quick, precise, no hesitation. She wasn't just a logistics officer anymore. She was something else. The rifle she pulled from her bag was compact, fitted with a suppressor. It wasn't standard observer gear. Her actions spoke volumes, but there was no time for anyone to question them. She moved with purpose, as though she had done this many times before. Chief Maris watched in disbelief as Rusk loaded her rifle. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, but his frustration was palpable. "You're supposed to be observing, not." But Rusk didn't wait for him to finish. She just shook her head, the quiet certainty in her eyes cutting through his words. "I'm going to neutralize the threat," she said, her voice calm, matter of fact. "Stay here and do your job, Chief. I'll do mine." Maris stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening. The woman who had been taking notes just hours before was now preparing to enter the very kill zone that had claimed so many lives. She wasn't asking for permission. She was simply doing what had to be done. The decision was made. The mission had shifted, and there was no going back. The radio crackled again, this time with a clearer transmission. "Echo 1, this is Overwatch. What's your status?" Maris's voice was steady, but the unease in his gut only grew with each passing second. There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that seemed to drag on forever. The tension was unbearable, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the crackle of the radio broke, followed by a calm, almost serene voice. "Echo 1, continue mission. Opposition is being neutralized." Maris's heart skipped a beat. The sound of her voice, so calm, so collected, made everything in him stop for a moment. Rusk. It was Rusk who was neutralizing the threat. But the question burned in his mind. Who was she? This wasn't the logistics officer who had been quietly observing. This was someone else entirely. His hand tightened around the radio, the uncertainty now creeping in. "Who's neutralizing the threat, ma'am?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The reply came almost immediately, as though it was the simplest thing in the world. "I am," she said, her words cutting through the static like a blade. Maris froze. The situation had shifted entirely, and he still couldn't wrap his mind around it. The woman they had all underestimated had just turned the tide. Without so much as a request for help or confirmation, she had taken matters into her own hands, shifting the odds in their favor. The SEALs, who had been frozen in place, began to stir. The sound of gunfire echoed from above them, sharp cracks that signaled the end of their immobilizing fear. The scar, which had held them in its grip for so long, was now alive with violence, but it wasn't aimed at them. For the first time in hours, The SEALs began to realize that the impossible had happened. The situation had changed. The enemy that had seemed invincible moments ago was now in retreat. Maris was the first to react. He raised his rifle and began scanning the ridge, not for targets, but for signs of movement. His eyes swept over the eastern slope, looking for anything that would explain the sudden change. And then he saw it. There was movement in the distance, quick, deliberate, purposeful. But it wasn't the enemy. It was Rusk. Her figure was barely visible against the terrain, moving with the stealth of someone who knew the land, as if it were an extension of themselves. She had gone from observer to participant, from quiet logistics officer to one of the most dangerous people on the field. Santos, still staring at the ridge, muttered, "Overwatch, this is Echo 1. What's your status?" His voice cracked through the radio, desperate for answers. Rusk's reply was the same as before, calm, professional, like she was reporting on a routine operation. "Continue mission. Grid 47 Charlie 3 is secure." The coordinates she mentioned were where two of the missing SEALs had been located, presumed dead. Echo Squad had been sent in to retrieve them, but the scar had kept them from completing their mission. Now, thanks to Rusk's unexpected intervention, those men were about to come home. Maris's heart pounded in his chest as he processed what Rusk had just done. She had single-handedly cleared a heavily defended position, without backup, without hesitation. He felt a wave of admiration wash over him. This wasn't just a logistics officer. This was someone who had broken the rules, and in doing so, had saved their lives. 20 minutes later, Echo Squad reached Grid 47 Charlie 3. The two missing SEALs, Martinez and Chun, were found alive but barely conscious. They had been prisoners, hidden away in a shallow cave, barely clinging to life after 3 days of captivity. Had it not been for Rusk's actions, they would have never made it out. The helicopter arrived to extract the squad, and as it lifted off the ground, the valley below seemed eerily calm. The scar, which had once been a death trap, now looked like just another stretch of barren land. But for those who had survived, something fundamental had changed. They would never look at the valley, or the people who had come to their aid, the same way again. Back in the helicopter, Rusk sat quietly, a field dressing wrapped around her left shoulder, blood staining her uniform. She had barely spoken since the extraction. The only words she had uttered were 4 simple ones. Mission complete. Status green. As the helicopter soared away from the valley, Maris sat across from her, trying to reconcile the woman who had taken notes and the one who had just cleared the field of enemies. "Ma'am," he asked cautiously, "what's your actual background?" Rusk looked out the window, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she answered, "Logistics for operations that don't officially exist." The conversation ended there, and Maris didn't press her further. There were some things, some people, that you didn't question, and Rusk, it seemed, was one of them. By the time the helicopter had lifted off, the scar, once a symbol of defeat and loss, had become a reminder of an unexpected victory. The land below, which had claimed so many lives, now felt like a graveyard that had been reclaimed by those who refused to give up. The SEALs who had once believed their situation was hopeless now had something new to hold on to. A lesson about courage, underestimation, and the power of quiet strength. Lieutenant Commander Ardan Rusk, a logistics officer no one had expected to make a difference, had proven something fundamental. Appearances can be deceiving. In a world where soldiers are defined by their firepower and tactical expertise, Rusk had shown that sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't see coming. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who's carrying the biggest gun. It's the one who refuses to accept that a fight can't be won. As the helicopter soared into the sky, Maris couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. He had learned a powerful lesson. Never underestimate the quiet professionals, the ones who blend into the background, the ones who observe without making a sound. Because when the time comes, they may just be the ones who save the day. Chief Maris kept that small patch, the one with a jagged valley outline and Rusk's name embroidered on it, throughout the rest of his deployment. Whenever someone asked about it, he would tell them the story of a logistics officer who had changed the course of a battle, the hero who had never sought recognition, and the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you least expect. And as he would often say, sometimes, when you think you've trapped someone, you discover that you've actually trapped yourself. Thank you for following the journey of Lieutenant Commander Ardan Rusk, the quiet observer who defied expectations and changed the course of a mission. Her story is a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes it's the unassuming ones who turn out to be the real heroes. So, how about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you completely underestimated turned out to save the day? Or perhaps you've had your own unexpected moment of bravery. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Requiem of Fear for more stories about heroes you didn't see coming. Share this with someone who knows that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you least suspect. And remember, true courage isn't always loud. It's often found in the quietest moments when no one is watching. Until next time, stay sharp and keep an eye out for those hidden heroes. The world is full of them,